Now we're going to shift gears just a little bit to ask a question from a slightly different perspective, and to say this. By the mid-20th century, various forms of photographic reality had really displaced painting's authority as a mode of conveying current events and as a mode of translating current events into historically significant and memorable ones. People got their news from the television, and even their sense of history was greatly augmented by photographic representations. At the same time, photography didn't occupy the same space on the wall as history painting had in the museum. So it sort of framed our collective memories of contemporary events and of history, but it didn't offer the same satisfactions of a museum-going experience as did monumental painting and sculpture. So we find an artist like Jeff Wall, an artist who is actually formally trained in art history, and at the same time an artist who's preferring to work in photographic media, asking himself, can photography compete with history painting? Can it compete with painting on the walls of the museum to offer a similar viewer experience and offer the rewards of a similarly intended mode of composition as the grand tradition of history painting? So we're looking at Jeff Wall's A Sudden Gust of Wind After Hokusai from 1993. And the first thing to say about this work is that it's very large. And the second thing to say about it is that it's not a photographic print on a wall, but a photographic transparency that has been mounted in a very large-scale light box so that you are looking at the photographic image saturated with light from behind the image. And that gives it a glowing, sort of hyper-realistic quality. It also gives it some of the lusciousness of oil painting as well, and that's certainly something that Wall would have been after. Wall makes a deliberate nod to art history in the composition of this painting, which is taken by a woodcut print from a very famous series called 36 Views of Mount Fuji that was done by Katsushika Hokusai in the early part of the 19th century. So this is Ariji Station in Suruga Province in Japan. And we can recognize a similar theme. Mount Fuji is just a simple line in the background, and in the foreground is this marvelous sweep of figures being disrupted by a sudden gust of wind and papers and their hats being swept into the sky by the force of that wind. So it's a woodblock print, and a woodblock print takes a certain amount of time to do, but it's a woodblock print, as all the prints in this series did, that focuses on these kinds of very temporal and ephemeral moments of weather, season, and small incident that makes them seem almost photographic in nature, even though this work was actually done before photography was invented. When we turn back to Wall's image, we can see that what he's really striving for is to get all the grace and the complexity of the composition by Hokusai, but using photographic technology. So the longer you look at this photograph, the more you start to think about how marvelously complex the array of windswept papers are arranged in the sky, and how deeply and almost durationally intended the work seems to be. So Wall is asking a question. What would it be like to treat photographic technology not as a form of hunting and capturing reality on the fly out in the world, in the conventions of documentary photojournalism, for example, but to approach it from the perspective of a painter, where every decision about the composition could be carefully planned, deeply intended, and organized by the artists themselves in relationship to every other detail of the composition. Ironically, he ends by making photography into a very slow technology indeed, one in which the kind of work of assembling digitally this composite photograph is equivalent to the work of making a very painstaking and detailed realistic painting. We could go on at some length to explore how photographic artists in the late 20th and early 21st century have interrogated the terms of history painting, have asked photography to occupy the same space in the museum and give a similar weight to the significant events of the contemporary moment. And you can find links to a few other artists in the supplementary materials for this course lecture. But instead, I want to make a little bit of an abrupt detour at the very end. And it maybe is a little bit surprising, but let me try to convince you otherwise. We're looking at a work by the Japanese artist Takashi Murakami. It's one element in a larger installation called Ego that he did in 2012. This is a monumental self-portrait of the artist, posed as a seated Buddha, and it's not made out of marble. And it's not made out of bronze. It's in fact a large inflatable. So it's drawn from pop culture technologies, and it's asking those pop culture technologies in the space of the museum to be as monumental as a stone sphinx or a great Buddha, for that matter. Murakami has said about this work that I have to produce work that will be able to survive and have relevance in 100 or 200 years' time, like the stuff in the Louvre. Well, you can spend some time looking at this work at your leisure and deciding for yourself whether or not Murakami succeeds in his ambition. Certainly there's a variety of opinions on this point. But the thought I want to leave you with is the thought of artists asking what kinds of technologies, what sorts of forms of figurative representation can hold up to the monumental conventions of the past and can do the work of storytelling in a way comparable to those great history paintings that we began this week with.